I'm Markus Daeschel, and I'm a reader in history, and I specialize in the history of Muslim societies in the history department. Before we can go into the question of why so many parts of the Islamic world are ruled by dictatorships, I think currently only one country you could describe as truly democratic, and that's Tunisia at the moment. All other countries in the Islamic world have a certain degree of coercive government in place. But before we can go to the root causes of this, it's perhaps important to remind ourselves just how widespread the Islamic world is. The Islamic world isn't just the Middle East. Those parts of the world that speak Arabic or Persian or Turkish, which you often hear about in the news, the Muslim world stretches far wider. It includes large parts of North Africa and East Africa. Countries like Nigeria, for example, have a very large Muslim population, but so do other parts of Africa like Tanzania and Kenya, Uganda, and so on. But they also stretch far further east than one currently imagines. So large parts of Southeast Asia are also predominantly Muslim. So the largest Muslim country population-wise anywhere in the world is actually Indonesia. And the largest region, if you want to group certain countries together with the largest proportion of Muslims, is actually South Asia and not the Middle East. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh together have one of the largest Muslim, or the largest Muslim population in the world. The reason I say this is simply to take the sting out of the question a bit, as it were. Because, of course, these countries are very different from each other. They have very different histories, they're very different cultures. And many of the problems that these countries face have to be seen in the context of their own regions. So, for example, if we want to understand why Indonesia has experienced a very high level of military intervention, for example, in its politics, maybe that should be understood not in the context of Muslims or Islam, but in the context of Southeast Asia and in the peculiarities of life in Southeast Asia. Or likewise, if we want to understand why Nigeria has been autocratic or authoritarian for much of its history, again, maybe the answer lies in the African or West African context rather than the Islamic context. And perhaps one could actually say, as a first answer to the question why so many countries of the Muslim world are ruled by dictatorships, well, maybe it's simply because they are poor. Because the fact is there are very few functioning democracies anywhere in the global south. Most countries that have functioning democracies over long periods of time are in the rich north, and it's very easy to understand why. If you live in a society where the basic needs of life are met, where there's a certain consensus over how politics and economics and so on should be run, you don't need very coercive government in order to keep things under control, keep things ticking over. It's a much harder task to begin with in a country where you have scarcity. Scarcity not just of resources, but also scarcity of workable identities, unclear borders, weak institutions, and so on. And that pertains really to pretty much all of the global south, regardless of what religious background a particular country is. It would also pertain, for example, to Buddhist countries, to a certain extent pertains to India as well, although there is, at least institutionally speaking, some form of democracy still in place, although the future of that looks quite questionable at the moment. So the first answer to the question would simply be because most Muslim countries are situated in the global south, and that's simply why authoritarian government is widespread as it is anywhere else. And this may not have anything particular to do with Islam as an ideology or religion. But I think we can be more specific about some aspects of this particular problem, particularly if you look at the Middle East in the narrow sense. So the area of land that reaches from, let's say, Egypt in the west through Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Turkey, into Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And of course also the Arabian Peninsula, so Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Because I think there's some additional factors that we could explore with regards to that particular region. And I think there's two that one could easily give. One is that many countries in that part of the world are actually the creation of compromises between different European powers who ruled over parts of that region at different points in time. So in other words, they're not countries that have their own long-standing history or secure identity. They're countries that bring together different population groups that don't necessarily want to live together. And of course, that creates an immediate seedbed for authoritarian government, because government has to be more coercive in bringing those different disparate groups who don't really see eye to eye, don't trust each other together in a single state framework within one set of borders or boundaries. And the best example here would be Iraq. Iraq is a country that simply exists because of compromises that were made between the French and the British as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, allocated different parts of the Middle East to either of those two European powers, and which brings together people who have very different aspirations, different histories, and different identities. So, for example, the Kurds in the north, the Marsh Arabs, who are often Shia in the south, and a lot of Sunni groups, very often tribal groups, in the middle. So Iraq as a country is very new, and Iraqi identity for that reason is always contested and weak, which in itself gives a lot of fuel to authoritarian government. But that's not true for all parts of the Middle East. That's also important to remember. So there are some countries which actually do have an ancient sense of identity. For example, Egypt has a very strong sense of itself that can be traced back for, well, if you want, thousands of years. So that problem doesn't exist in a uniform way across the region. But something that does exist pretty uniformly across the region is actually, ironically, that the influence of Western European powers and Western imperialism, and in that I would also include Russian imperialism for the 19th century and later, has actually been relatively weak. So in other parts of the world, European powers very often simply claimed parts of land and took them over as colonies. The Middle East, which had the Ottoman Empire still in place until the time of the First World War, was a much more contested region. It was a region where no one European power could ever really claim control over any particular part for a very long time. And that led to a lot of instability and internal conflict, which again then could be used as an explanation for why authoritarianism became so widespread. So it's no coincidence that one of the very few places in the world where European colonialism has never managed to establish a foothold are actually in the Middle East. Turkey is a country that was never colonized by a Western power, at least not directly. Iran was a country that was never taken over by any Western power directly. And Afghanistan was a country where something similar applies. And it's precisely because you have this, if you want, toxic interplay between different European powers, often working against each other. The Russians, the Italians, the Germans, the British, the Russians, all trying to get a foothold in this region, but none of them actually being strong enough to keep the others out and fully claim what was going on. That created a great deal of political instability, and also meant that international conflicts, the rivalry, let's say, between the Russians, the Germans, and the British in Iran, let's say, were directly translated into internal conflicts within Iran itself, because the Russians would pick one particular faction that was powerful, who would do their bidding, the Germans would pick another faction, the British would pick a faction. So Iranian internal politics became very messy and chaotic as a result of different European powers trying to gain influence. And that, of course, also gave a lot of room for maneuver to local governments, because they could, again, play out the different powers against each other and actually remain in charge and establish themselves, perhaps, or maintain more independence for themselves than had been the case elsewhere. So I would argue that in the context of the Middle East itself, it is actually ironically the fact that Western imperialism was strong, but perhaps not strong enough to really take over local affairs, which created to a very chaotic and messy situation that has endured until today. It's important, of course, to also remember why European powers were so keen to exercise influence in the Middle East. And To that, you can immediately come up with two very important answers. One is oil, of course. Our entire civilization runs on oil, and the Middle East happens to be a place where most crude oil in the world is found, or at least the most cheaply accessible form of crude oil. So it became a strategic necessity for all European powers, including Russia, so East and West, for both camps, to establish a foothold in that region. And another part of the answer is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which has also dragged European powers into the region and necessitated fairly strong levels of interference. Why? Because the conflict is so evocative for so many people around the world, and the conflict between actually a fairly limited number of people, only a couple of million, in a very small part of the world, means so much to people around the world because it ties in with things like history, the Holocaust, what it means to be Western, what it means to be colonized, settler colonialism, and so on. You can look at it from so many different angles that gives an added importance to this, and again has invited more interference that you would probably have seen elsewhere. So the fact that democracy hasn't been able to flourish in the Middle East, despite actually several attempts in many countries of the region to establish democratic government. I mean, most recently in the so-called Arab Spring, when we had uprisings pretty much everywhere, from Egypt, in Syria. Tunisia is the only country where they were actually successful in the end, and there is still a democratic system in place now. So it's not for lack of trying. Local people have, like anybody else in the world, of course, do want to live in a state that is not coercive, that doesn't torture, that doesn't send people to secret prisons, that doesn't prescribe what opinion you should have. But all those efforts have ultimately been subverted because the Middle East is so closely integrated, I think, in big geostrategic considerations of powers elsewhere. And I think this shouldn't really be an easy blame game. I can fully understand why an American policymaker, for example, would be concerned about the price of oil and the control of oil. That's in a way their job. If you want to ensure a rich and life plenty for American citizens, and then this is automatically part of your consideration. And similarly, if you're a Russian policymaker, of course you have to think about similar issues as well. So I don't want to pursue this or portray this as a very simple blame game, but it is a fact that the Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring, was subverted by the fact that it just created too much uncertainty for outside powers to let it go ahead unchallenged. So pretty much everywhere, local governments have been able to clamp down, but, and this should also be said, without really bringing this basic problem of the Middle East, that everybody is meddling and nobody can really take charge of it, to an end. So if you look at Syria, for example, and how the Syrian civil war is panned out, again, there's meddling of Turkey, Russia, the United States, and other countries that simply can't come to an agreement of what should actually happen with Syria, and that has continued the civil war there and has allowed a particularly ruthless dictator, the Assad clan, to remain in place. And you could make very similar arguments also for other parts of the Middle East, for example, Iraq, to a lesser extent Egypt, and also the Gulf states. So this problem that the Middle East in a way is the object of interference from abroad, because it's so important in terms of geostrategic position as a producer of oil. But at the same time, that these outside powers are actually unable to really impose order on the Middle East because they can't agree who should get what. That problem persists and has allowed dictatorships in the region to survive, who wouldn't have otherwise survived.